Imagine going from running a national mental health program for the Veterans Affairs to becoming homeless and unemployable, all because of psychiatric medications that you thought were safe. Well, that's exactly what happened to Derek Blumke, and today he's here to expose the hidden dangers behind the VA's psychiatric drug crisis, the devastating toll it's taking on veterans, and the staggering data that the public isn't being told. Stay with us because you won't believe what's uncovered. We're joined today by Derek Blumke. He's a veteran who has been spearheading advocacy for safer prescribing practices in the VA. He's been very vocal about the risk of suicides with antidepressants. And I'm so happy to have him here to share with us everything that he has learned about this important topic. Derek, welcome. Go ahead and share a little bit about yourself and jump into your presentation.
Thanks, Joseph. It's great to finally be in touch with you and meet you after following all the work that you've been doing for years. So my name is Derek Blumke. I'm the Veteran Impact Fellow for the Grunstyle Foundation. I came on board of this organization a little over a year ago, and my sole tasking was to address the epidemic of overprescribing of psychiatric drugs to veterans and the role these medications play in veteran suicide. So I came here and onto this issue as many do through own personal experience. And so I had a pretty interesting background. I'm from rural northern Michigan, wound up going to the Air Force right out of high school. I did 6 years in the Air Force, was deployed twice to an air base in southern Uzbekistan called K2. Third deployment to Afghanistan, all as an aircraft maintenance technician with the Spectre gunships. Got out. Transitioned to community college, wound up at the University of Michigan, started what now is the largest chapter-based student organization in the world, which is Student Veterans of America, 1,600 chapters, 4 countries, and the organization is solely focused on helping veterans transition to college. And so that was my experiences. Had a challenging transition, and that inspired me to help others find a community. And so I ended up going from SVA. My first job out of college was actually running a national mental health program for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs in their headquarters. I ran that for about a year and a half, called the Vital Initiative. It was from that experience I learned kind of how we do mental health in America, and really through the lens of the VA. But we do outreach, we do screenings, we refer folks to counseling, we do the diagnosis. And along that path, we always wind up prescribing someone, and probably 90% of the cases or more, prescribing someone to get that acute crisis under control so they can accept treatment, or that's been the approach. And it's right at that point where we're starting to run into problems, in that we didn't fully understand the scope and scale and risk profiles of these medications, because we had gaps in FDA regulatory safety issues where we were not following the data. We were following ghostwritten papers, as you've reported on. And the result is that we've had an epidemic going on for probably 40 years or more with the modern class of antidepressants and other medications. And so I ended up running that mental health program, moved to New York City, got into technology startups. And it was during that time I got prescribed Adderall, went from Adderall to Ambien to gabapentin, 2 or 3 other drugs. The cocktail that many who are listening to this and watching this today have experienced, and I ended up being trapped on Zoloft for a year. And that was the last medication I was on. And so going from starting Student Veterans America, running a national mental health program for the VA, building a technology company, to in short order becoming unemployable, and by the VA's definition, homeless, I realized there was a big problem. And I realized if this is happening to me, I could imagine how many other veterans this is happening to. With my background in leadership and mental health, Joe and Jane Vet didn't stand a chance. And that, I believe, is what we're seeing today. And so that's what we're working on. And that's what this presentation that we're going to kind of walk through today. Actually, this presentation was built and created for the former VA secretary, because a little over a year ago, I was able to ask him a question at a public forum, former VA Secretary McDonough, where I asked, first I led with, I'd met a young veteran just a week before. He'd been prescribed an 8-drug cocktail of psychiatric drugs by the VA. That young veteran, I would later learn, We were prescribed by the same psychiatrist of all people. And when he went to get off these medications, after he lost his family, lost his job, everything, he then found that he had permanent or persistent sexual dysfunction after he stopped the antidepressant. And so I posed this question to the secretary, is that this is this young veteran that I met. There are gaps in informed consent, and I'd like to talk with you about those gaps. And so about 2 weeks later, I had a full hour meeting with him in his office, walking him through the background of what's going on, a lot of the data, much of which had to be stitched together because the VA doesn't release prescription data. They don't provide prescription rates. Anything that we have has really been stitched together from FOIAs, some studies which had some data points for us on prescription rates or suicide rates associated with the medication, and then the public data that's available as it relates to the veteran population under VA care and outside of VA care. So that's kind of what this is. And I've been presenting this throughout the past year or so, and every time it's kind of just shock. People can't believe it. So I'm going to start here as just a thought exercise. Is is it possible to understand the number of veterans that are dying by suicide based upon studies that have already been done on suicide risk profiles and medications, and the total number of veterans under VA care that are being prescribed these medications? So and really looking at the VHA, or Veteran Health Administration, VHA using veteran population, and that's the veterans have used the VA in the past year. Because we can really zero in and nail down on some of this data, because while a lot of this is not public today, the VA is sitting on probably the largest tranche of health data, best data in the world, because we've got what is likely the largest closed healthcare network in the world. And so like everything that is done, whether it's for health, mental health, issues with toxic exposures and the like, we're able to really zero in on this data. So a study out of Europe found that about 0.08% suicide risk for the first 6 weeks of being on an antidepressant or antidepressant starts. This is a study that Dr. Martin Plodel out of Austria has worked on with others across Europe. And so just using this as a thought exercise, so about 0.08% suicide risk for that first 6 weeks on an antidepressant. We then know that about 1.75 million veterans under VA care use or are prescribed antidepressants annually. And so this is from a FOIA from 2019 data. And so we've got that 1.75 million, and then you multiply that out by your 0.08% suicide risk for antidepressant starts. So if all that 1.75 million vets started on antidepressant in a given year, you should expect, or could expect, 1,400 VA using veteran suicides in that year. And that's just the antidepressant starts. That's not switching from one medication to another, as we know can be tricky and dangerous. That's not deprescribing, which is your focus, Joseph, is helping people get off these medications safely. But as we know, that's a really challenging time and can be a risky time as someone's tapering off of a medication. And so that said, not all of the 1.75 million veterans prescribed antidepressants are starting those medications annually. So let's just speculate. So 150,000 vets start an antidepressant annually. With that, multiply that out by your 0.08 suicide risk, you might expect 120 veteran suicides just on antidepressant starts alone. And then if you start looking at these other risk profiles, whether it's benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, where we've got a little bit better data on suicide risk, we can really start putting a math equation together, start stacking up what we might see is what's going on to the total number of suicides at the VA and outside of the VA. So for VA using veterans, approximately 2,500 to a little over 2,600 veterans take their lives annually of the total 6,000 plus veterans that die annually nationwide. So the 2,600 vets kill themselves annually while under VA care or VHA care. And so just that these numbers in this equation is fitting within that total number of veteran suicides while under VA care is, I'd say, concerning. And the question we're kind of posing is if we know, if we can speculate or even have a half close guess that we might be seeing 120 veterans take their own lives just by antidepressant starts, isn't that enough to investigate this and make prescribing practices safer to reduce risk? And that's kind of what our larger thesis is with this issue is what can we do to make prescribing safer? It's not about taking medications away from anyone, because a lot of folks are concerned about that. They hear these conversations and they become afraid. And the reality is that our goal is just to make prescribing safer. So the larger problem here is veteran suicide rates continue to increase despite increased spending. So I think it's about $17 billion have been spent on veteran suicide and mental health initiatives over the course of the past 20 years. 517 million, I believe, is budgeted for this year for mental health and suicide prevention initiatives. So as we keep throwing the dollar after dollar after dollar, and in the investment community call it bad money after bad money, we here for the 18 to 34-year-old veterans can see increases of suicide rates from 2001 to present day that looks like a rocket ship. Like if you were an investor in a startup technology company, this would be a win. You'd be rich. But unfortunately, this is the exact opposite. This is a loss of life and tragedies that are occurring. And what's sad is that these folks fit within that box warning for the suicide risk of antidepressants warned by the FDA. So our calls to action are not to, again, take away anybody's medications. It's not to take these medications off the market. It's simply to make it safer. So right now, you talk to a lot of clinicians, mental health counselors. They have no idea of the real true risk profiles of these medications. They don't know about issues with dependency. I met with this VA psychologist last year, my psychologist at the time. When I started talking about brain zaps and my experience of going through antidepressant withdrawal, bolts of lightning hitting me in the head, black blips of time vanishing with those bolts of lightning, nausea, dizziness, room spinning, paranoia, bordering on violence. She didn't know what I was talking about. And so when I said brain zaps, she looked confused. And I found myself explaining what antidepressant withdrawal was to my psychologist. And that's so troubling because a lot of veterans, a lot of Americans, a lot of anybody on these medications, they don't know what they're getting into a lot of times. And it's largely because the counselors and the prescribers aren't trained on this in their PhD and MD programs or even their social work programs. And psychologists and social workers are furthermore discouraged from talking about medications with their patients because the culture is that that's a doctor's job. So I don't know what you see or hear about that in the field or what your experience was going through medical school, or do they train you, social worker, psychologists, not to be talking about this is our job, or what was your experience?
I mean, I'd never heard of, we heard about the common risks, Derek, but the ones which I believe are the most important for people to know about these meds, which would be PSSD, I never heard of it. The idea of dependence and tolerance, and that if you start these medications, they can be incredibly difficult to stop, and it can maybe take, several years sometimes for people to come off. And then finally, the other important one is the risk of protracted withdrawal, where if you taper someone too quickly, you can actually have a degree of neurological damage. And so the actual risks that I think would sort of tip the scales and make someone think twice about them, I never heard about them. I heard a lot about, you might get a little nauseous, you might have a little bit of insomnia at the start, but otherwise, you could have some sexual dysfunction that only exists when you're on the drug. Otherwise, it's safe and effective. It was a very one-sided view on them, and it was only after I looked into the data I found the risks that you'd actually want people to know about.
Were you told when you were going through med school? When did you finish up with med school? What year?
I finished medical school in 2014.
Okay, so that would have been before the petition to the FDA regarding PSSD and persistent sexual dysfunction. But even still, I don't think anybody even really heard about it afterwards because this wasn't marketed. People weren't told about this stuff at all. Med schools are not. The FDA didn't even respond to it, so they ignored it.
Yeah, exactly. But PSSD, it's been in the medical literature since the 90s. Protracted withdrawal has been known since the 90s. All of these things have been out there, but it's been and you think because there's such significant risks, the American Psychiatric Association or other psychiatric leaders, they would have a big section on it on their website saying, we acknowledge these, these things and that they're frightening. And here's why we think we should still practice the way we do. It's not acknowledged anywhere in any guidelines. Effectively, it has been ignored for 3 decades. A lot of these things just conveniently sidestepped. And so doctors don't know about it.
As a layperson and policy advocate, I just find it just insane.
Yeah.
The doctors aren't being told about this stuff, and patients are going through this every day. And instead of seeing side effects, they're seeing schizophrenia, they're seeing bipolar, and then we're seeing cocktails of lithium and antipsychotics that take people out of the workforce and take them out of being able to have a functional life. So So even still, it's just this is just absolutely insane. This is going on today still. So our calls to action again are basically information and informed consent, and that's really down the road is retraining of our medical establishment, starting with the VA, signatory informed consent, forcing the doctors to have real conversations about risk profiles and efficacy, major issues across the board. Reform deprescribing guidelines, whether it's the Maudsley deprescribing guidelines out of Europe with Mark Horowitz, whatever it is, slower, safer is the way to go. Red alert system. Veterans are being cold turkeyed off of their psychiatric drugs, antidepressants, benzos, antipsychotics because UPS ran late, or because there's a 48-hour window in which veterans can have their prescriptions make the call to have their medications refilled. And if they miss that window, they have the risk of running themselves out of meds, but they themselves don't even know how dangerous that can be because the doctors didn't tell them, the doctors didn't know. These are like very simple changes. These are rudder adjustments, differential diagnosis, getting the root cause. Is it that we're dealing with someone who has toxic exposures like myself, exposed to radiation and chemical weapons overseas? Is it environmental? Is it work stress? Whatever it may be, we're not looking at those things, and instead we're just treating symptoms. And so, and then finally, release of public data, or publicly release the data the VA has on suicides and medications, because this stuff is just not out in the world. And if researchers and other experts and advocates like myself were able to look at this data, I think we'd have a very different conversation about what's going on in the world. So the way I've got this structured is risk benefit. So basically showing the increased suicide rates caused by suicides and psychiatric drugs, overprescription. So is this working? And if it's working, does that benefit outweigh those risks? Undisclosed harms. So this is stuff that we've been talking about with withdrawal, with sexual dysfunction and the like. Now learning about birth defects, brain development issues for infants whose mothers are on SSRIs. And then what I've realized as I give these presentations is I can't talk about this issue without talking about the criminality from the drug companies, because at the end of the day, none of this is possible without criminal action. If data is not manipulated, if studies are not ghostwritten, if those things didn't occur, we can't even have this conversation today. So what we're looking at is about 68% of all vets that use the VA for their healthcare are on a psychiatric drug, 28% are on antidepressants. These statistics I put together about 8 months ago using some information that we put out through FOIA. And again, the VA's own public data on their VA using population, number of veterans using the VA.
Just to give some context here about this figure, in the US, back in 2018, 13.2% of the population were on antidepressants. I think I've seen some data from the CDC recently that about 20% of Americans take some psychiatric medication, or took a psychiatric medication in the last year. And so this is, the rate of psychiatric medication use based on these figures here. I mean, it's much higher than what we're seeing in the background population. This is a population of people who are, getting prescribed over 3 times as much as the general pop.
And we're wondering why we're seeing the outcomes that we're seeing with veterans. So veteran suicide rates are approximately double that of the civilian population. And so if you start looking at the suicide risk profiles of violence, unemployability and the like, all these things just make sense. And so is what our goal is really just make people smarter on this. Because like you mentioned, these prescription rates are like triple the general population. And when I tell people this prescription rate, they're like, "That's not possible." And when I'm actually getting VA counselors and clinicians contacting me asking me for my source or citation because this information isn't out anywhere else in the public, I've had it confirmed through my meetings with mental health leadership at VA. And so I'm now referring them to mental health leaders at VA because the VA doesn't have this data out in the world. So it's like, it's just troubling. Like VA employees are coming to me asking me, where is this data coming from? And I'm saying, talk to your bosses. They've got it. This should be out in the public. So, so then you look back at other GAO reports. So we got these high prescription rates. Then we have from a GAO report from 2015, a Government Accountability Office, 94% of vets under VA care with a depression diagnosis were prescribed antidepressants, and only about 15% of diagnosed patients were offered psychotherapy instead of psychotropics. And as a patient myself during that time, that absolutely tracks. I actually was denied counseling because I didn't want to go through a group program in Ann Arbor, a mental health group program. And the reason was I knew everybody and I was ashamed of myself. I went from this awesome career to being unable to take care of myself. And so I denied the group. And because I denied the group, I was not allowed to see a counselor. But the medications continued. I'd go 5-6 month gaps at times where I'd never even talk to my prescribing psychiatrist. The meds would just show up in the mail every month. And I was really on my own. And so then we've got active duty prescription rates. From 2010, there's approximately 20% of all vets or active duty troops prescribed antidepressants. Another study out of a researcher out of Columbia University, joint VA, Columbia University researcher, found as part of his study that 37 to 43% of active duty troops were prescribed psychiatric drugs in their last year of service, most commonly antidepressants. And then we've got other studies showing that approximately 24% of vets actually seek VA care in their first year after discharge. And so while some veterans may go out and get their own private health care, may go and go to see their local hometown doc, where those exist anymore, majority are just getting cold turkey off of their psychiatric drugs. They're not given 2-3 months of medications to get them through to the next appointment, 30 days max. And if they are not warned about how dangerous that can be, just being run of your meds, that's what we're seeing. So the first week, first quarter, first 6 months, first year are the highest suicide rates and suicide risk for the veteran population. And again, veteran suicides are approximately double the rate of the civilian population. And so if we're looking at this from just the number of vets prescribed these meds on active duty, or number of troops prescribed these meds on active duty, to those that are prescribed seek help or VA care after discharge, you've got like a 13% gap of those who are actually getting care. So like you might assume that maybe 10 or more percent are just getting cold turkey outright. Never mind those that are just stopping because they weren't told the risk profiles. And then finally, we've got postmortem suicide toxicology data from studies going back about 10 years. At that time, between 2010 and 2014, 24% of service members and veterans who were tested showed positive test rates, showed positive toxicology reports for antidepressants in their blood systems. So these are all tracking with prescription rates that we're seeing. And so we shouldn't really be surprised that we're getting the outcomes that we're getting. We then have warnings from the FDA passed in 2004 and 2006, which could have only been added if there was causality shown. And they found that to be suicidal thoughts and behaviors, which for whatever reason, maybe you can explain this to the audience or myself better, but why we split apart suicidal thoughts and behaviors, whatever that means, from attempts, from completions. And so the arguments we see from the APA and the establishment is that, oh, well, those are just thoughts and behaviors. That's not attempts. That's different. And no, that's just thoughts and behaviors. That's not completed suicides. That's different. Some of this backward logic, I just can't wrap my head around, and I can't even appreciate it or even try to make sense of it anymore. But
it really, I mean, it's an attempt to minimize it. So, you know, when the FDA did this analysis, they tracked 3 types of things: thoughts, behaviors, and completed suicides. Completed suicides are actually quite rare, and so we weren't able to see any change in the suicide rate between the groups on the drug versus not on the drug. But for suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior in a statistical significant way, when you stratified it out by age group, anyone under age 25, they're actually at increased risk of both of those outcomes, suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors. And I think it's a foolish argument to say, well, at least it wasn't completed suicides, because simply put, the data set's not big enough to pick up on that event increase. And the highest proxy for a completed suicide is suicide attempts. And so, I mean, it's some way to try and minimize what this is actually showing, which is that people struggle to believe this. Like, they struggle to believe that we would even prescribe these medications to people under age 25, when more likely than not, compared to a group given placebo, you're at an increased risk of actually trying to take your life if you prescribe the drug. And who cares whether it reduces symptoms on a depression scale? There's something about being on the medication, whether it's the blunting or the impulsivity that it can sometimes cause, that's actually pushing people towards suicide attempts and very likely completed suicides, more than would be seen just in the background rate in the group not taking the drug.
And what's wild about all of this is when you start looking at that formula that we kind of started with, is you can really, similar to what you have to do if you're starting a company or you're looking for venture capital or investors, you have to be able to show what your profitability might be or what your revenue might be expected to be, unit sales. And so none of those things, when you're creating these financial models for investors, is going to be perfect. And what we have, though, is we have enough data on risk profiles of benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and we know the number of patients prescribed these medications nationally. You should be able to start getting a ballpark projections of what we might expect. And this is where I think we're going to start looking at this is nothing is going to be perfect. No data that we have is going to be perfect, but we've got to work with what we've got. And right now the outcomes are trash. We're also seeing other studies showing from Healy from 2003, 3.4x greater suicide rate for those treated with SSRI than those chose non-treatment, 2.3, 2.5x higher suicide attempt rates for antidepressants versus placebo by a couple different studies. Study after study have been coming out over the years showing this. Then we've got the individual personal stories where you've got folks like Tucker Moneymaker and this gentleman, along with Nedra Walnut. They both testified at the 1991, what we now call Prozac hearings, where Tucker described his wife had been prescribed Prozac for 5 weeks, shot her 16-year-old son, 8-year-old son, then killed herself. Been on the med, again, just under 5 weeks. Nedra Walnut, never been suicidal prior to being prescribed Prozac, suicidal the entire time being on Prozac, and then suicidal thoughts immediately stopped as soon as she stopped Prozac. And then you've got folks like Connor Brumfield working with his family now, 22-year-old Army veteran, was a student veteran in Butte, Montana, was prescribed Wellbutrin for 8 days after he'd gone into the VA for old ankle injury and a vision test. But because we are so focused on screening, he tested positive for moderate depression. He was prescribed Wellbutrin. 8 days later, he's dead. Attorneys are now saying that there was no documentation of a conversation about informed consent. We've also got Hunter Whitley working with his mom, Shannon. He was on a medication for a month and a half, mirtazapine, another medication, 23-year-old vet. But with Hunter, we've got an OIG investigation from the VA that showed failure to provide informed consent, failure to provide safe medication management, and the like. And so we've got suicide risk profiles. We've got prescription rates off the charts. We also have efficacy that is trash. Those who've read the 1988 and 1991 PDAC hearings for Prozac and Zoloft, I have. I don't think the rest of the country has. Maybe you have, Joseph. But the entire debate, like most people haven't read this, like super nerd, and I just can't let this issue go. The entire debate was about efficacy. The entire debate of this 10-member panel was they couldn't agree that there was efficacy, and it actually took an FDA commissioner to say, oh, your job is not to deny, your job is to approve if you can even see some shred of benefit. And so what we have is former head of the NIMH. For years, Thomas Insel was recognized as America's psychiatrist, invested big time behind the medical model, biological model of illness, mental illness. He's coming out and saying it was striking how poorly all of the antidepressants performed across the entire population. And so when you've got that not so great efficacy, not so great outcomes and benefits, and you've got huge risk, it really tips the scales of what we're actually talking about with risk benefit and having that conversation with the doctor.
The other thing that I would just say, Derek, here is just, it's not a secret. I mean, you like you said, we have the director of the NIMH, the nation's top psychiatrist, publicly coming out and just saying, these drugs, they simply are not that good. And that's not what people hear from their doctors, safe and effective. And so that there's just huge confusion about the safety and the efficacy of these meds. One little thing I just wanted to add about informed consent. Informed consent is not just non-existent in the VA, it's non-existent in routine care. And where most of these drugs are prescribed, the experience of getting them from a PCP usually goes like this. A PCP has about 7 to 8 minutes of FaceTime with someone. They'll spend 5 of those minutes maybe talking about some cardiovascular stuff or, just building rapport. If they decide to start a medication, they usually say, maybe some nausea, a bit of insomnia, but otherwise it's fine. You then get the script from them. They haven't given you informed consent. They've spent like a minute or two talking to you about it at most. You then go to the pharmacist. The pharmacist shoves like a little electronic reader at you. You don't even look at it, but the box says, I was given a chance to ask questions about the medication. You just tick it and they hand you the medications. There is no legitimate informed consent taking place in most medical settings across the US.
Well, how is that even possible if they're not even trained on this? Like if they're not, if you finishing up your MD program, or Mark Horowitz finishing up his MD program, finished all of his medical training, was never trained at all on antidepressant withdrawal, brain zaps, any of this. How could they possibly provide informed consent? Because they themselves don't know. Instead of seeing these side effects as being what they are, they're seeing bipolar and schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. So, I mean,
They can't. You're right. I mean, they're not doing it. They don't have the time. They haven't heard about it before. And I mean, I wonder if we add to that, that policy, the ask list, and not just for veterans, but for the entire country, that we need some video resources. When you get a medication, like on the bottle, there's a QR code and it says, watch me before taking this. And so if the doctors and the pharmacists aren't going to do it, we can have a government agency or an independent third party summarize everything. There could be an abbreviated version. There could be a longer version for someone who wants to maybe spend half an hour learning about the drug. But we are not doing it justice anywhere at the moment.
Right. And that's where I think there are a lot of people that have been working on this issue for years or are part of the harm community are kind of inspired with Kennedy coming in and talking about antidepressants and other psychiatric drugs. The executive order that came out a few weeks ago, the Make America Healthy Again executive order, calling for investigations in the prevalence of and threat of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, antipsychotics, several other classes of medication stimulants. I mean, I wasn't sure how I liked the term threat initially, but when I wrote a resolution calling for investigations in these drugs back in 2019 for the VFW and American Legion, I wrote the headline of this resolution being the antidepressant harms analysis resolution, like calling for research investigations in the role of antidepressants in veteran suicides. And the reason I did so is because we're not talking about looking for better efficacy here. We're talking about those who've been harmed that have not been listened to and have been gaslit and ignored. And so we're just in such a strange alternate universe right now. And it's tough processing kind of how we got here. So then we also have, for folks in the field of suicidology, this is kind of confounding. So if you see the red line between 2001 and 2006, there wasn't a huge increase. That's your 18 to 34-year-old veterans. So with that population, traditionally young people have not killed themselves at higher rates than older people, traditionally. And so when these numbers started to invert, say in mid to late 2000s, 2006, 7, 8, and 9, you start seeing an increase of suicide rates for the 18 to 34-year-old group in red, where you don't see that with the other populations, with other age groups of veterans. This is confounding for the field of suicidology. And when you look at this issue with the box warnings, especially as you look at the box warnings that warn of suicidal thoughts and behaviors for adolescents and young adults up to age 24, well, that's fitting within our young vet population. And so then on the right, again, showing that increase in suicide rates, because a lot of what we're seeing coming from the VA and mental health is talking about beacons of hope, trying to find the silver lining in any of this. And the reality is we just need to be honest with ourselves. And that the reality is the suicide rates for most veteran age groups and demographics have been increasing since 2001. And so we've seen like a 10% increase or 10-point increase in suicide rates for some of these groups. So then you've got studies coming out of Europe. Again, this is from Martin Plodel and others. This study actually was done to kind of refute the box warning argument that was created by the APA and folks in the industry back in 2004. So in the box warning, for those who are not familiar, when the box warning was first added in 2004, the APA and the field of psychiatry lost their absolute freaking minds over this, because they were claiming that kids were going to kill themselves because parents were going to be afraid of getting help for their children for their quote unquote deadly depression. Well, the reality was that the antidepressants were increasing suicide risk. And so even today, we'll still find news articles and op-eds saying that this box warning should be reevaluated. Heck, there's even a presentation coming up in Utah at there's a conference, AAS, it's the American Association of Psychiatric Pharmacists. The first session of the entire conference is talking about reevaluating the box warning for adolescents. Is it causing more harm than benefit? And so what we see again is, just like we saw previously with the increase in suicide rates for 18 to 34-year-old veterans, now we're looking at antidepressants. Here, this is your prescription rates of antidepressants from 1996 forward. Huge spike and increase for 10 to 19-year-olds. Then you've got your suicide rates. It had actually been declining throughout the 90s, coming in the early 2000s. Increased prescription rates. Suicide rates start to flatten. Prescription rates drop after the box warning comes out, as was expected. Again, the industry kind of messaged, oh, this box warning is not necessary. It doesn't apply to everyone, yada, yada, yada. And then prescription rates went right back up, and suicides, you see this huge uptick. Next group, young adults. Now we're talking about our young veteran population. So increase in prescription rates, box warning. Again, this is correlation, not causation. But when you look at the causative data we looked at earlier, look at the correlative data here, you see, again, suicide rates are coming down for 20 to 24-year-olds. Prescription rates start going up. Suicide rates follow with them. And then this is 24-year-olds and up. Green line here is your prescription rates of antidepressants. Here again is your suicide rates coming down even from 1986. Started a precipitous decline. And then here we hit 2000. All of a sudden, these lines start to cross. And we start seeing almost a direct parallel, like line by line, year by year, increases in suicide rates with those prescription rates. And that's going back to 1996 when we first started getting antidepressant data and prescribing. Then historically, veterans who use the VA historically have done better as it relates to suicides and mental health. So going back to 2005, our blue line here, that's our VHA using veteran or veteran who has used the VA in the previous year. Our green line is the veterans who've not used the VA in the previous year. So again, historically, veterans did better when going to the VA for their mental health and for care. And then you start seeing in 2010 where, again, even these lines invert. And so about 5 years ago, I co-authored a study with Robert Whitaker that also showed there's a 32% higher suicide rate for veterans who use the VA versus veterans who did not. And our thesis is that screening plus drug treatment equals increases in veteran suicides. And again, this is kind of what we're seeing. And so again, trying to explain how is it that somebody has better access to mental health care, better access to counseling, better access to treatment, better access to medications. Because if these medications were safe and effective as we're told, they should be doing better. We should not be seeing higher suicide rates. And that's not what we're seeing at all. So, and then finally, we've got this, and all these slides are actually coming from, these charts are all coming from the VA's annual suicide reports over the years. And so this chart here is showing veterans who use the VA without a mental health or substance abuse diagnosis. So think generally more healthy population. The red line there is people who received a mental health treatment. So maybe think like somebody's prescribed Witt-Doerring off-label for smoking cessation. So that would be a mental health drug prescribed for someone who does not have a mental health diagnosis. Those veterans have much higher suicide rates for those who are treated for mental health conditions, or say Witt-Doerring for smoking cessation, than those who receive no treatment. In both groups, no mental health diagnosis, no substance abuse issues. Some of this stuff is just so confounding. And when a layperson even looks at this, experts look at this. I mean, what's your reaction in kind of some of these slides so far?
I feel like we've been, well, my reaction is, there's a few ways that I would look at this. I mean, if you would have talked to me when I was like 15 years old and you said, hey, you know, before I went into any school, so Josef, we have a group of people, you know, one of them, they get drugs, which kind of mask their symptoms. You know, they cause tolerance, and, you know, we really don't know what they do long term. You know, so we get a group of people, they're unhappy. One of them, we're going to drug them, and the other group, we're going to not drug them. You know, we're not going to do that. They'll find other ways. Who do you think is going to commit suicide more? I'd say, well, it's probably the people who you drug, because when is it ever helpful to drug away someone's symptoms with drugs that cause tolerance and can be unpredictable? And like that would have been my intuitive understanding as a 15-year-old, knowing about drugs and treating root causes. But then I got massively confused because I went into medical school and essentially got bombarded by a million different studies that told me that depression was, you know, a chemical imbalance, and that we had these magic bullet serotonin drugs that fixed it at the root cause. And, you know, there were all these studies. And then I would have been, this is so confusing. Why would people who are getting, you know, the best evidence be doing that? And now I've come full circle, and I've been able to see enough to go back to my original intuition, where I'm like, yeah, no shit. You know, if you put lots of people on meds, you know, some of them can become suicidal because there's paradoxical reactions. It's unpredictable. We really don't know what happens long term, but I guess at least we do know with things like antipsychotics, it can cause some brain damage. It can cause tardive dyskinesia. It can cause brain shrinkage. We know that happens with lithium. We know it happens with benzos. Why wouldn't it happen with antidepressants as well? You know, it happens with alcohol. It happens with cannabis. It happens with methamphetamine. Anytime you expose the brain chronically to chemicals, people get sicker over time. And so, you know, it took me probably like 10 years of being immersed in this to sort of see through it. And now it doesn't surprise me. I'm like, yes, you know, I would see that. But I went through a hell of a lot of misinformation or gaslighting, or just not even gaslighting. I mean, just biased information, marketing presented as science from drug companies to get confused. But it makes sense to me now.
It's still just insane that, like, you're going to medical school and you're not being trained on this stuff, and you're given the exact opposite information of what a layperson would look at and say, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I had a conversation with one of the mental health leaders at VA a while back, and they said to me, the jury is still out whether antidepressants cause suicides at the macro level. And he paused and he said, but you can certainly say that at the individual level. Enough individual cases stack up to a data set. I don't understand the logic behind this approach. I can't, because I don't think there is any logic behind it, because anybody with half of a brain hearing this has a tough time wrapping their head around it. And the only people that have the inabilities to process this thought are those who are the most educated and those who have gotten a medical degree.
Yeah.
So,
but we know, I mean, we now know that's
horse to death, but
it's not true. You know, yes, it can happen at the individual level, but the FDA meta-analysis shows that it's more suicide attempts in people under age 20. And I know when Hengartner and Plodel actually did another analysis looking at adults that was done with more recent clinical trials, they also find increased suicide rates in adults. Mm-hmm. So at the at the individual patient level, yes, it can do that. We know that. And right. At the macro level, it looks like it's more suicide attempts in the people who get on these medications. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some people who are helped by them. It just means that
Absolutely.
if you just give them to a population, you're actually causing more suicide attempts, which is crazy.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's beyond comprehension at this point, especially when this has gone on for 40 years, and we've got the number of victims that we've got, and the number of harm that's been caused, and the data that we've got to support it. That we're not acting, and again, I mean, we're kind of circling back to where we began, which is the summary is that these medications have not the greatest efficacy. We've got huge known suicide risk profiles of most of these medications, huge prescription rates for the VA population, as you mentioned, double or triple prescription rates than the general population, the civilian population, down the list. And again, the calls to action are not the nuclear option here. The calls to action are just making it safer and informed consent and retraining of clinicians and prescribers. So kind of where we're at now is the undisclosed harms and the things that you've really been featuring in a lot of your podcast. So FDA does not warn of SSRI-induced sexual dysfunction. Basically, this is sexual dysfunction that people experience after they stop the medication. We've known, though the data was not really publicly released or the public was not aware, about 50% sexual dysfunction rate for those on an SSRI is what we've now learned. Historically, we've been told, oh, it's here and there, maybe 5% max, 1 or 2%, what we were told initially. Now we're learning it's like 50% of those on the antidepressant developing sexual dysfunction while on the medication, but no one's been told that can persist long after. Basically, people becoming asexual, no libido whatsoever, no feeling in the genitals, no anything, and that they've known about this. The FDA received that petition in 2018. There's no excuse for not taking action, and here we are again, taking lawsuits to get the government to do its job. Public citizens suing the FDA for failing to respond to that petition. So Here we are. We've got.
I mean, there was another frightening statistic, especially in that New York Times article, Derek. They featured a study done by Yasi Priani in gay and transgender youth. Turns out that 30% of that population takes antidepressants. And when they asked them if they had enduring sexual dysfunction after coming off, 10% of them said that they had enduring sexual dysfunction. Now, that's much higher than that other statistic. There's a statistic from an Israeli study that found that it occurred in 1 in 216. But this study in the gay and transgender youth, the rate was 10% in people.
Wow.
And so no one really knows exactly where that is. Is it 1 in 216? Is it 1 in 10? Or it could be anywhere in between that. But I mean, this is obviously a very private issue that people aren't going to be talking to their doctors about. But I suspect it's more common than people actually think it is.
Mm-hmm. I mean, look at Mark Milich, Army veteran, who's been a huge pushing heavily on this with specifically finasteride, PSSD, and from finasteride, the hair loss drug, and the bravery it takes for him and those in the PSSD network to go forward and talk about this, something so personal. But that's what it's taking. It's taking shame articles in the news and personal stories being told to the public rather than our regulatory agencies acting for us. So we've got then folks saying it feels like I've been lobotomized, possible consequences of SSRIs. We've got then further brain and cranial development issues of infants whose mothers are on SSRIs. These studies are coming out just the past couple of years. All along we've been told, oh, it's fine. SSRIs are safe while you're pregnant. Data is not supporting that whatsoever. And I think if most women, most mothers were told that there was a risk of any possible adverse outcome for their child, they had a very, very, very different approach to this, especially when it's come time to.
Yeah. And this is one of those things where the animal data on this is really bad. You know, in utero exposure to antidepressants for baby mice and rats, or exposure during maturation, so as children or adolescents, these mice go on to have altered sexual behavior later on. They're less social. They engage in less mating behavior. And so when you look at the animal studies, there is something about disrupting the serotonin system, which consistently shows behavioral changes later on. And that's why people, they also wonder, is antidepressant use associated with autism as well? And in epidemiologic studies, there are some hints of that as well. But what people usually hear is, this is the line. They say, well, animals aren't humans. We don't know what's going to happen to humans, so let's not report on that. Or they say, what's the other thing that they say? We need more evidence. Now, How about this? We need more evidence to prescribe these drugs to pregnant mothers and to children with developing nervous systems. They don't say that. They say, we're going to keep on doing what we're doing right now, but we need more evidence to show it's unsafe. And then they go ahead and they don't fund the evidence. They're not involved in doing the research at all. They just say, oh, we just need more of it. It's terrible.
Well, and it's that approach doesn't happen anywhere else. So as a former aircraft electrician in the Air Force, if there was any chance at all that the aircraft would be made unsafe for operations, planes grounded. If there was any risk that the issue in hand, whether it was a generator having issues, there are backup systems on airplanes, but that plane's not going to fly. And so how is it that this approach is we need more evidence that there might be a problem here when you're dealing with something that can take someone's life, cause them to harm their loved ones? Like we've seen this over and over again. Like how the approach to this is, you don't see this with anything else. If there's a risk of harm to somebody, the first thing we're doing is, oh, well, there's a warning for a chainsaw. Chainsaw can chop off leg. Mm-hmm. I think most people would be aware of that, but there's little cartoons on a lot of chainsaws where it has a warning of what not to do and not to have the chainsaw blade too close to your leg. Like, I know this seems kind of silly kind of analogies here, but where else do we see, oh, we need more evidence that this could possibly kill someone?
I've got examples.
I'm sure you do.
Anytime there's billions of dollars to be made, you see it. So whether it's with smoking, whether it's with pesticides, anytime there's a huge, enormous industry behind it, we need more evidence. It's just that's the playbook.
My grad school critical thesis is on institutional corruption. So I looked at the chemical industry, pharmaceutical industry, and the auto industry. GM was making cars that they knew had design failures that were the steering wheels were impaling the drivers. Cars were flipping over at 30 miles an hour because they didn't put a sway bar on because the engine was in the rear for the Corvair. Like it's example after example after example. Influence regulators, co-opt nonprofit and advocacy groups. I mean, it's the same playbook over and over again. And then here, the New York Times article on the left, that actually ran the same day I was going through acute antidepressant withdrawal. And a former friend, a friend of mine at the VA, former head of mental health for the San Francisco VA, I told him what was going on: brain zaps, bolts of lightning, confusion, paranoia, all these things. He says, you need to look at this article. And that article happened around the same day that I was going through this acute antidepressant withdrawal. I finally got a dose of the antidepressant Zoloft. Magically, all these symptoms just vanished. And so, and again, kind of where we started, you can't have this conversation and be honest with anybody unless you're talking about the fraud in the background of how we got here. And so GlaxoSmithKline, probably the most infamous study in this area, which was a study on Paxil for kids. We can talk about the incentives that the government created, multi-billion-dollar incentives the government created for GSK and other drug makers to test these medications on children. But this study here, which most folks in the harm community are aware of, but those who are kind of new to this aren't. Study 329 is a study done early 2000s. GSK hired a researcher at a Brown University to conduct the study, and then hired a separate marketing firm to write the study or ghostwrite the study. This is industry practice. When I first read this, I couldn't even believe it. And if it weren't for these releases still being on the Department of Justice's websites, I'd still have a tough time wrapping my head around the evil behind this. But they hired the marketing firm. The marketing firm never saw the raw trial data. And so when they went to write the study, they wrote the drug Paxil for kids was safe, there was no major adverse events in the trial, and that the efficacy was far better than placebo. The data showed, though, that the efficacy was that of placebo, and that there were completed suicides in the trial. So between the fraud that GlaxoSmithKline committed related to their trial on Paxil for kids, and then misrepresentations of trial and off-label marketing of Wellbutrin, they settled with the U.S. Department of Justice for $3 billion. Within a 3 or 4 year period, here's an overview of this study. It's just like beyond layperson's comprehension. Any normal person reading this is just, how can you be this callous and this evil? Then you look at Pfizer, $2.3 billion settlement for fraudulent marketing of psychiatric drugs. 1.1 billion or 1.3 billion of it was criminal. So largest criminal fine in U.S. history. Big shocker. The drug company. Forest Pharmaceuticals, 313 million, Johnson & Johnson, 2.2 billion, all within a 10-year period. And so what we have is a criminal enterprise is what we're really dealing with. When we talk about the cartels, this is the cartel. When we're talking about safety, efficacy, and harm to community, the opiate epidemic is not an outlier. It is the exemplar of what we're dealing with. And psychiatric drugs are following the same exact line as what we saw with the opiate epidemic.
And there's a really cynical line in there as well, Derek, where some people have said that this is simply the cost of doing business. That drug companies they're more than happy to sort of lean into this, to do everything that they can to misrepresent the findings to the extent they think they can get away with it, to overhype the benefits and minimize the harms, because they know that's going to boost sales. It's going to lead to profits. And then when they get sued, they'll pay the settlement. They'll still end up above. And because the way the justice system works in this country is that usually they're okay with just getting a fine. They don't send the corporate executives to prison. It was the corporation. You know, the responsibility is diffused. No one really does any time, and so they're quite happy to just pay off the government when they get caught.
Right,
and that's the playbook. That's how this happens.
Yep. And so for those in the military community, we're used to accountability. Like, we're used to, if the commander screws up, commander takes responsibility. If commander gets people killed unnecessarily, harms people, harms their troops, that individual either is held accountable, resigns themselves, at least until the Afghanistan withdrawal, at least until that point. But there's no accountability. There's no criminal prosecution. When there is a criminal prosecution, the CEO is not going to jail. The shareholders are paying a fine. That's the end of the day for them. And so, like, has Pfizer been held accountable for their fraud as it relates to the chemical imbalance theory of depression? Like, I don't know if this has probably been seen by, again, a lot of your viewers, but this is a sad cloud commercial from the 90s for Zoloft, where you got your sad little cloud marching around. You've got your chemical imbalance. You've got your synaptic cleft there. Your little dots, your serotonin neurotransmitters. I liken it to being a football field, and the little football players or the serotonin neurotransmitters are running a route from one end of the football field to the other, and then they're running a turn route back. And so what they marketed is that this drug blocks the reuptake of serotonin in the synapse, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, as the name of the class of drugs even implies, and it increases serotogenic activity in the brain, thereby solving for depression. And then what we found just 2 years ago, Joanna Moncrief, the work she's doing in the UK, almost all the data that we're seeing is all coming out of Europe. There's no connection whatsoever between serotonin deficiency and depression. And this is in my Psychology 101 textbook on my bookshelf right now, referenced no less than a dozen times, that there is a serotonin deficiency that results in depression. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're trying to sell a medication or treatment, who's going to want to take that treatment if they don't know how that treatment even works or even have a baseline idea of it? And so when we're talking about this criminal background here, you can't decouple this from this conversation, because if you do, none of this makes any sense. Like, that these medications came out 40 years ago, and that we're having all these issues just today, magically they're coming up. What I believe is instead we're seeing a critical mass of victims, similar to what we saw with the opiate epidemic. You can't throw a stone today and hit someone who has not been directly impacted by this issue, or has a family member who's been harmed in one way, shape, or form. And if they don't believe they've been harmed, you start having a conversation with them, talking about their experiences. They start reflecting back on when they lost their job or went through a divorce. You start looking back, oh, I just went on this medication during that time, or I was just stopping this medication during that time. And all of a sudden they're reevaluating their entire adult life of what happened to me, what happened to my family, what happened to my job and my career that was doing so well. And so then we have violence, the dirty secret that nobody really wants to talk about. But we have data and studies showing there's an increased prevalence of violence for those on antidepressants, and especially those on smoking cessation drugs. These classes of drugs have the highest prevalence of violence that you can find almost anywhere. Then you look at the individual case stories and studies of what's been going on across the country. And in this case, on January 4th of 2022, Julia Larson's family, her parents, took her to the VA clinic in Chico, California. The Chico clinic had been fighting to keep prescribing psychiatrists and psychiatric nurse practitioners on staff, been unable to. And so when Julia's family took her to the clinic, they arrived. The VA is required to treat someone if they show up at the facility. They're required to care for them. And what she was told is, we don't have the abilities to see you today. You're going to have to come back. And so all these details here, constant barrage of electrical shocks. She wanted pills to calm her down. All this came from ProPublica news reporting, several long form articles about her death, or excuse me, about multiple long form articles from ProPublica investigating this case. And all these things came out in these stories. In addition, Julia's got a OIG report that was done about what occurred. But so she shows up on January 4th, is turned away, has all these symptoms, needs medications, gets turned away. That night, she gets in a firefight with her dad in the house. A bullet goes stray, ends up hitting her mom in the thigh, killing her mother. That same day, Andrew Isles, Air Force veteran, called the VA clinic saying he'd stopped taking his medications. He'd become paranoid again. Anybody who's gone through a psychiatric drug withdrawal knows one of the top symptoms is paranoia. And so the VA clinic, again, short staff, couldn't keep up with the patient demand, said, we can't see you today. Come in 2 days, start your medications again. We'll see you in 2 days. January 5th, Andrew shoots his mom with a shotgun. And so within just over 48 hours of each other, two veterans who had been both going through psychiatric drug withdrawal killed their mothers. You see this case after case after case. I've got another person I've been working with. He was prescribed a huge cocktail of medications, ended up murdering his 3-year-old son, showed up to prison. Prison psychiatrist looks at the medication, asks him, so what medications are you on? Starts rattling them all off. And the prison psychiatrist says, that's not possible. The VA wouldn't do that. And sure enough, prison psychiatrist looks at the medical records, and it's like just this massive drug cocktail. And the prison psychiatrist says, you need to get an attorney and you need to get a forensic psychiatrist. And that's what he did. And he ended up getting it out early because it was they saw the role of these medications and the death of his son. So story after story, data after data set. And then you also have failures in addressing this crisis. So we've got a couple of huge missed opportunities. In 2010, the House Veterans Affairs Committee held hearings looking into the role of medications in veteran suicide, specifically psychiatric drugs. Unfortunately, we had the 2 APAs there and another research psychiatrist out of Weill Cornell, Anel Prim, Dr. Anel Prim of the American Psychiatric Association, talked about, while we acknowledge the concerns expressed regarding the use of psychiatric medications, particularly antidepressants, and their alleged links to suicide rates among veterans, we urge caution against hasty legislative actions that might limit access to these vital treatments. Existing evidence does not conclusively support a direct causal relationship between antidepressants and increased suicide risk. That testimony killed this hearing, killed this entire conversation. 1991, the Prozac hearings is what we now call them. This hearing was actually chaired by a VA psychiatrist. That same individual chaired the PDAC hearing that approved Zoloft, also chaired the hearing that approved Prozac, and then in that same year, chaired the hearing that was investigating SSRIs and violence and suicides. And so how is it that you could possibly have an unbiased opinion? Never mind almost all the panelists were receiving funds from the drug companies, whether it's speaker fees, research dollars, or whatever it may be. You had horror story after horror story after horror story, expert after expert coming and testifying and saying these drugs are causing suicides, causing violence. Those two missed opportunities back in 1991 and 2010, tens of thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe we could have saved, but we'll just never know. And so I don't know if you remember the Mother's Little Helper, anybody who's watching this. This was a marketing campaign by Roche, marketing the first two benzodiazepines to market, first Librium and then Valium. So Rolling Stones, 1996, hit song Mother's Little Helper. What we saw then is from 1955 to 1979, we saw some pretty weird stuff with suicides in America. So 1930s, early 1930s, that was the Great Depression. This is the peak of suicides of white males in the United States. The other line that we're going to look at is non-Hispanic white women, 45 to 54, this line here. So here, early 1930s, suicide rates, this was the highest they'd been for women up until that point, at least where we'd been collecting data. Then you fast forward 1955. This is when the first benzos came to market, marketed by Roche. Then you see, again, you're watching white males, continued decline of suicide rates for white men. But what you see here from 1955 through 79 is a near doubling in suicide rates for non-Hispanic white women during this period. And what was happening during this period, it was the mass proliferation of benzodiazepines across the United States, resulting in the 1979 hearings by Ted Kennedy investigating the benzodiazepine epidemic. It was around this time the public began becoming aware of benzos. Maybe Mother's Little Helper is not as helpful as we thought. Maybe there's risks are coming with this drug. Prescription rates decline. Suicide rates drop with them. So prescription rates drop by, I believe, 2/3 during this period. Suicide rates followed with them. Then fast forward to the era of modern psychiatric medications, SSRIs. Again, increasing suicides for women and skyrocketing suicides for men, because I think we're finding that men have a little bit more violent responses to some of these meds, especially young men. And what a lot of people don't know, though, is this is where the Sacklers made their first money. This is Arthur Sackler. He built that campaign for Roche and then for Pfizer, marketing other benzos for Pfizer. This is the first time where you saw a deal between a marketing firm and a drug company where they went from, hey, I'm going to do a $1 million, $500,000, $200,000 contract to run a marketing campaign for you, to, hey, I want X number % off of every pill that you sell. And that's where the family made their first money. And so what we're really seeing today is a model that was really largely created by Arthur Sackler and his family. So fast forward, here we are today, benzo epidemic. We've got the Wall Street Journal that just came, news article, Generation Xanax, the dark side of America's wonder drug. This is just from 3 or 4 or 5 days ago, this news report. And we knew this is a crisis and this is a problem back in the 60s and 70s. They're making songs about it back then. Then the VA with the annual suicide report on the right here, veterans with sedative use disorder. This is the first time the VA ever mentioned a psychiatric drug or class of drugs at all, any point in any of the annual suicide reports. And they did it through the lens of sedative use disorder. Veterans with sedative use disorder had a 29.2% increase in suicide rate. When I saw this, I was just disgusted because the first mention ever of a psychiatric drug is basically blaming it back on the veteran for another disorder that we have. When in reality, you can really only get sedative use disorder primarily from being prescribed these medications from a doctor. And so, again, also on the left, veterans with psychotic conditions other than schizophrenia and bipolar. Diana Hazel Rodriguez, friend of mine, colleague with the Grunstall Foundation, she was prescribed Prozac. 2 months later, had a psychotic event. Court order took her kids. 2 of her eldest kids were taken away through adulthood. 2 years later, she got off the meds almost immediately. 2 years later, was prescribed Prozac again. This time, they immediately took her off the Prozac, diagnosed her Prozac-induced psychosis. I don't know how we're even having this conversation at this point. So again, just kind of closing out, the actions that we're calling for are not to stop prescribing, not to take medications from anyone, I think we learned from the failures of how we did the corrections to the opiate epidemic, just cold stopping, yanking people off drugs without them having an opinion or input on those decisions. We can do this smart. We can do this safe. And what we can do is we can do this by stopping this epidemic of prescribing, and we start providing real informed consent to veterans, civilians, and alike. So,
Derek, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. You've covered so much. I mean, before we wrap up for the day, do you want to leave the audience with any final thought or comment?
Yeah, just for those listening, I just want to say thank you for being part of these conversations, for trying to bring this issue to light. If you're going through this yourself, understand that there's hope and there's light at the end of the tunnel. You can get off these medications safely if you're having a problem with them. If they're working for you, I could not be happier, because the conversation that we're having today is not about taking a drug away from someone who feels it may be helping them, but instead is about having informed consent and having real conversations about the safety and the benefits of the treatment. And so for those listening, if you want to become part of this movement, part of this conversation, help drive reform the VA across the country for all veterans, for all Americans, go to the Grunstyle Foundation's website, grunstylefoundation.org. We'd love to hear from you, love to hear your stories, and love to help put this crisis to an end, because it's gone on for far too long. And it's something that we can solve probably 25% of all veteran suicides by simply making prescribing practices safer and providing more information for patients and doctors. So, Josef, I just want to say thank you for everything that you've been doing. There are not words to show my gratitude for you stepping out of the company line and doing what's right, because there's not enough people like you.
Thanks so much, Derek. And thanks for sharing this amazing presentation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
If this video was interesting to you, be sure to check out this one right here.